The day my daughter told her friends I had never worked a day in my life while sitting in the house, whose mortgage I literally approved every month as CEO of Meridian Financial. I knew our relationship had reached a breaking point. I never saw coming. What happened next changed everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Effie Morrison, and at 64, I thought I had finally earned the right to speak openly about my accomplishments. After 38 years climbing the corporate ladder from a filing clerk to chief executive officer of one of the largest mortgage companies in the Pacific Northwest, I had built something that mattered. But somehow, my own daughter Rebecca had completely erased that history from her mind, reducing my entire career to nothing more than invisible labor that didn't count. It started on a rainy Thursday evening in October when I stopped by Rebecca's house in the suburbs of Portland to drop off some family photos I had digitized from my late mother's collection. Rebecca lived in a beautiful colonial-style home with white shutters and a wraparound porch that she and her husband Marcus had purchased 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had personally reviewed their loan application, but Rebecca didn't know that detail. She had no idea that Meridian Financial held their mortgage, and she certainly had no clue that her mother sat in the corner office, making decisions that affected thousands of families just like hers. When I knocked on the front door, I could hear laughter spilling out from the living room. Rebecca opened it with a wine glass in her hand, her cheeks flushed from whatever celebration was happening inside. She looked surprised to see me, glancing back over her shoulder before stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary, and I could see her college friends scattered around the kitchen island, faces I recognized from years of holiday gatherings and graduation parties. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, not unkindly, but with that tone that suggested I was interrupting something important. I held up the manila envelope containing the photos and explained that I had been sorting through Grandma's things and thought she might want copies of the pictures from her childhood. Rebecca took the envelope and set it on the hall table without looking inside, then gestured toward the kitchen where her friends were continuing their animated conversation. I should have left them. I should have made an excuse about having dinner plans or an early morning meeting, but something about the warmth of the house and the sound of easy laughter drew me in. I hadn't realized how quiet my own home had become since retiring 6 months early. After decades of back-to-back meetings, conference calls, and constant decision-making, the silence of my empty house felt oppressive some evenings. Rebecca introduced me to the group, most of whom I had met before, and they were polite enough to include me in their conversation. They were discussing career changes, promotions, and the challenges of balancing work with family life. Sarah, who worked in marketing for a tech startup, was complaining about her demanding boss. Jennifer, a nurse, was talking about the emotional toll of her job. Marcus, Rebecca's husband, chimed in about his recent promotion to senior analyst at an investment firm. I listened quietly, sipping the glass of wine Rebecca had reluctantly poured for me, feeling oddly like an outsider in this group of professionals sharing their work experience. When Sarah asked what I did for a living, I opened my mouth to explain about Meridian Financial, about the complexity of mortgage lending, about the responsibility of overseeing a company that employed over 800 people. But before I could speak, Rebecca laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, my mom never really worked," she said, as if she were sharing an amusing family quirk. "She was always just around the house when I was growing up, very traditional, you know. Dad was the breadwinner." The wine glass nearly slipped from my hand. I stared at Rebecca, waiting for her to correct herself or acknowledge that she was joking, but she had already moved on to asking Jennifer about her upcoming vacation plan. The conversation flowed around me while I sat frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Never really worked. The words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I thought about the early mornings when Rebecca was in elementary school, when I would drop her off at before-school care so I could be in the office by 7:30 for senior management meeting. I remembered the evenings when I would pick her up from after-school programs, still in my business suit, mentally reviewing loan portfolios while helping her with homework at the kitchen table. I had worked part-time when she was very young, then gradually increased my hours as she got older, but I had always been working, always building something. The promotion to regional manager had come when Rebecca was in middle school. The vice presidency happened during her sophomore year of high school. By the time she graduated, I was already being groomed for the executive suite, but somehow she had never absorbed any of this information. In her mind, I was just Mom, the woman who packed her lunches and attended her soccer games, not Effie Morrison, the professional who had spent decades analyzing market trends and making million-dollar decisions. I excused myself from the group and walked to Rebecca's powder room, ostensibly to freshen up, but really to collect myself before I said something I would regret. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who had always taken pride in her appearance, even in retirement. My silver hair was professionally styled, my makeup understated but polished. I wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, the same uniform that had served me well in countless boardrooms. But standing in my daughter's bathroom, listening to her friends discuss their careers in the next room, I felt invisible. When I returned to the kitchen, the conversation had shifted to homeownership and the challenges of the current real estate market. Marcus was explaining how difficult it had been to secure their mortgage, how many hoops they had jumped through, how grateful they were to finally find a lender who understood their situation. I nearly choked on my wine. Their situation had been straightforward compared to many applications I reviewed daily: good credit scores, stable employment, reasonable debt-to-income ratio. The approval had been routine. "The mortgage industry is so complicated," Sarah was saying. "I don't understand how anyone navigates all those regulations and requirements. Thank goodness for people who understand that stuff." Rebecca nodded emphatically. "Seriously, I could never do that kind of work. All those numbers and legal documents, it's like a different language." I set down my wine glass with more force than necessary, the clink echoing sharply in the sudden quiet. Everyone looked at me and I realized this was my moment to speak up, to correct the narrative that had somehow formed around my life. I could explain that I not only understood that different language, but had helped write some of the regulations they were discussing. I could mention that mortgage lending had been my specialty for over 3 decades, that I had started in underwriting and worked my way up through every department. Instead, I heard myself making polite excuses about the late hour and thanking them for the wine. Rebecca walked me to the door, chatting casually about weekend plans and reminding me about Marcus's birthday dinner the following month. She hugged me goodbye with genuine affection, completely unaware that she had just erased 38 years of my professional life with a single careless comment. Driving home through the dark streets of Portland, I replayed the evening over and over, trying to understand how this perception had formed. Had I been so focused on being present for Rebecca's childhood that I had failed to communicate the importance of my work? Had I downplayed my achievements to avoid seeming like I was bragging? Or had Rebecca simply chosen to see only the parts of me that fit her preferred narrative? My house felt even quieter when I walked in, the silence amplified by the contrast with the lively gathering I had just left. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in my home office, surrounded by the awards and recognition plaques that documented my career progression. Regional Manager of the Year 2008, Outstanding Leadership in Community Development 2000. Each piece of hardware represented years of 60-hour workweeks, difficult decisions, and personal sacrifices that had allowed me to provide Rebecca with opportunities I had never had. I pulled out my laptop and scrolled through my LinkedIn profile, reading the endorsements from colleagues and industry leaders. Phrases like visionary leadership and transformative impact and unparalleled expertise filled the screen. I had connections with executives from major banks, regulatory officials, and community leaders across 3 states. My professional network was vast and respected, built through decades of competence and integrity, yet my own daughter thought I had never worked a day in my life. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with the conversation that kept replaying in my mind. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the garden I had been neglecting since retirement. The roses needed pruning, the lawn needed mowing, and the flower beds were choked with weeds. For 38 years, I had paid a landscaping service to maintain this yard, because I was too busy building my career to spend weekends on gardening. Now I had all the time in the world, but no motivation to fill it. My phone rang just after 9, and I saw Rebecca's name on the screen. For a moment, I hoped she was calling to apologize, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. To acknowledge that she had misspoken the night before. Instead, she launched into a cheerful recap of the rest of the evening and thanked me for stopping by. She mentioned that Sarah had asked for my recipe for the cookies I had brought to Rebecca's house warming party, the ones I had actually purchased from an expensive bakery, because I had been working late on a complex commercial loan restructuring. "You're so domestic, Mom," Rebecca said with obvious affection. "I wish I had inherited your homemaking skills instead of being such a disaster in the kitchen." Domestic. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had spent my career analyzing risk, managing teams, and making decisions that affected millions of dollars in lending. But in Rebecca's mind, I was defined by cookies and homemaking. I managed to make appropriate responses to her chatter, but when she hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since my first week of retirement. I drove to the Meridian Financial Building downtown, parked in the visitor lot, and walked into the lobby I had entered thousands of times over the years. The security guard recognized me immediately and waved me through with a warm greeting. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt familiar and strange at the same time, like returning to a house you used to live in. My former assistant, Patricia, squealed when she saw me approaching the corner office that had once been mine. She had worked with me for 15 years, and had become something like a daughter to me, someone who understood both my professional capabilities and personal dedication to excellence. She updated me on recent developments in the company, the new policies being implemented, and the challenges facing the mortgage industry in the current economic climate. "How's retirement treating you?" she asked, and I found myself struggling to answer. How could I explain that retirement felt like erasure, like all the work I had done for nearly 4 decades had simply vanished the moment I cleaned out my desk? How could I admit that my own daughter had no awareness of what I had accomplished, or why it mattered? Instead, I mentioned that I was still adjusting to the slower pace, and asked about some of the loan officers I had mentored over the year. Patricia filled me in on promotions, transfers and new hires, painting a picture of an organization that continued to thrive based on the foundation I had helped build. The conversation was professionally satisfying but personally hollow. I was already becoming a memory in this place that had defined me for so long. Walking back to my car, I passed the coffee shop where I used to grab my morning latte before important board meetings. The barista who had served me for years was behind the counter, and she recognized me immediately. We chatted briefly about how strange it must be to have free time after so many years of structured days. She mentioned that she had always admired how poised and professional I looked, even during obviously stressful periods. "You were like this powerful presence," she said, smiling. "We always knew when something big was happening because you would order an extra shot of espresso." Powerful presence. The phrase stayed with me as I drove home, contrasting sharply with Rebecca's dismissive comments from the night before. How was it possible that a barista who saw me for 5 minutes each morning understood my professional identity better than my own daughter? That evening, I called my sister Margaret in San Francisco, needing to talk to someone who had witnessed my career journey from the beginning. Margaret was 4 years older and had followed a more traditional path, marrying young and focusing on raising her 3 children while her husband built his medical practice. She had always been supportive of my choices, even when other family members questioned whether I was prioritizing work over motherhood. I told her about the conversation at Rebecca's house, trying to keep my voice level as I repeated Rebecca's casual dismissal of my career. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before responding with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" she said. Rebecca said, "You never worked." Did she forget about all those times you missed family gatherings because of board meetings? Did she forget about the business trips, the late nights, the weekends you spent reviewing loan files? Did she forget that you paid for her college education with your salary? Margaret's indignation was validating but also painful because it highlighted how much Rebecca had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. I had made sacrifices for my career, missed school plays and soccer games, hired babysitters for evening events. I had tried to balance everything, but there had been costs. Perhaps Rebecca's dismissive attitude was her way of coping with feeling like my work had sometimes taken precedence over family time. Maybe she needs to see what you actually did, Margaret suggested. Maybe she's so used to thinking of you as just mom, that she can't imagine you in any other role. You should show her your old office, introduce her to your colleagues, help her understand what you built. The idea appealed to me, but it also felt risky. What if Rebecca wasn't interested? What if she dismissed my professional achievements as irrelevant to her current life? What if she saw my need for recognition as petty or attention-seeking? I had spent my career projecting confidence and competence, but this felt vulnerable in a way that professional challenges never had. Over the weekend, I found myself sorting through boxes of career memorabilia that I had brought home when I retired. Performance reviews that documented my steady progression through the company ranks, photos from industry conferences where I had been a keynote speaker, articles from the Business Journal that featured my insights on mortgage lending trends, a framed copy of the press release announcing my appointment as CEO, describing me as a visionary leader with an unparalleled understanding of the residential lending market. Looking at these artifacts of my professional life, I felt a strange disconnection, as if I were reviewing someone else's career. Had I really given speeches to audiences of hundreds of industry professionals? Had I really testified before state regulatory committees about fair lending practice? Had I really built a department from 12 employees to over 200? The evidence was overwhelming, but Rebecca's casual dismissal had made me question the significance of everything I had accomplished. Monday morning brought a call from my former colleague David Chen, who had taken over as CEO when I retired. We had worked together for over 20 years, and he had been instrumental in convincing the board to promote me to the top position when my predecessor retired. David was calling to invite me to a reception honoring women executives in the financial services industry, an event where I would be recognized for my contributions to the field. "You have to come, Effie," he said. "They're specifically highlighting your work on expanding access to homeownership for first-time buyers. The programs you developed have helped thousands of families achieve their dreams of owning a home." The recognition was gratifying, but it also emphasized the disconnect between how I was perceived in professional circles versus how my own daughter saw me. Industry leaders wanted to honor my achievements, but Rebecca didn't even know what those achievements were. I accepted the invitation, partly because I genuinely wanted to support other women in the industry, but also because I was beginning to formulate a plan. That evening I called Rebecca and mentioned the upcoming reception, describing it as a professional event where I would be honored for my work in mortgage lending. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was involved in anything professional, asking questions that revealed how little she understood about my career. "I didn't know you knew about mortgages," she said, and I had to grip the phone tighter to keep from saying something sharp in response. "I've worked in mortgage lending for most of my adult life," I said carefully. "It's been my career since before you were born." There was a pause, and I could hear her processing this information as if it were completely new. "I guess I never really thought about what you did during the day when I was at school," she admitted. "I just knew you were always home when I got there." Always home when she got there. The comment revealed how much effort I had put into maintaining that illusion of availability. I had rearranged meeting schedules, conducted conference calls from my car, and brought work home every night to ensure that Rebecca never felt like my career was more important than her needs. I had been so successful at hiding the demands of my job that she had concluded I didn't have one. "Would you like to come to the reception with me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "It might be interesting for you to see what I do." "What I did," Rebecca agreed, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We made plans for her to meet me at the hotel where the event was being held, and I spent the rest of the week carefully planning what I would wear and what I would say. This felt like an opportunity to bridge the gap between who Rebecca thought I was and who I actually was, but I was nervous about her reaction. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Heathman Hotel, the same venue where Meridian Financial had held its annual shareholder meetings during my tenure as CEO. I arrived early, partly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to compose myself before Rebecca got there. The room filled quickly with familiar faces from across the industry, colleagues and competitors who greeted me with genuine warmth and respect. "Effie Morrison," called out Janet Walsh, the president of a rival mortgage company. How's retirement treating you? We miss having you to keep us all honest. Similar greetings came from every corner of the room as I made my way through the crowd. Regional bank presidents, regulatory officials, real estate industry leaders, and fellow executives who had worked with me on various initiatives over the year. The conversation was effortless, filled with industry terminology and shared experiences that reminded me how deeply embedded I had been in this professional community. Rebecca arrived just as the formal program was beginning, looking slightly overwhelmed by the size and sophistication of the event. She had dressed appropriately in a navy dress and heels, but I could see her scanning the room with obvious uncertainty. I introduced her to several colleagues, watching her face as they shared stories about working with me on complex deals or seeking my advice on challenging situations. Your mother is a legend in this industry, said Tom Rodriguez, a longtime loan officer who had worked under my supervision for over a decade. She taught me everything I know about risk assessment. When I was starting out, she would spend hours explaining the nuances of different loan products and how to match them with borrower needs. Rebecca nodded politely, but I could see she was struggling to reconcile this image of me with the person she thought she knew. She brought coffee when she picked up Sophia, stayed to chat instead of just grabbing her and leaving. It was everything I'd wanted for years, but it felt hollow, somehow. Performed rather than genuine. I found myself analyzing every interaction, wondering if she was being nice because she actually wanted to repair our relationship or because she wanted back into my will. And that uncertainty poisoned everything, made even pleasant moments feel calculated and false. The truth was, I didn't know how to trust her anymore. Too many years of feeling like an afterthought had created a protective shell that I couldn't just crack open because she'd suddenly remembered how to be considerate. Trust, I was learning, was easier to break than to rebuild. But Sophia, bless her heart, was thriving. At 16, she was old enough to understand that there was tension between her mother and grandmother, without necessarily understanding all the details. She'd started coming over more often, sometimes just to hang out and talk, sometimes to help me with my new hobbies, or to teach me the latest social media trends that Madison had once found so embarrassing. One afternoon in October, while we were working on a jigsaw puzzle at my kitchen table, Sophia looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Madison at that age. "Grandma Clem," she said, "are you and Mom fighting?" I considered my answer carefully. Sophia was almost an adult, deserving of honesty, but she was also Madison's daughter, and I didn't want to put her in the middle of our conflict. "We're working through some things," I said finally. "Sometimes adults need time to figure out how to treat each other better." She nodded thoughtfully, fitting a piece of blue sky into place. "Mom's been really stressed lately. She keeps talking about making things right with you, but she doesn't know how." "What do you think she should do?" Sophia shrugged. "I think she should just be herself, instead of trying so hard to be perfect. You've always loved her anyway, right?" Out of the mouths of babes. Sophia had cut right to the heart of something I'd been struggling to articulate. Madison's recent efforts to rebuild our relationship felt artificial because she was trying to be the daughter she thought I wanted instead of just being herself. But the problem was, I wasn't sure who herself really was anymore. That evening, after Sophia had gone home, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and really thought about what I wanted. Did I want Madison back in my will? Did I want to rebuild our relationship? Did I want to forgive and forget, or hold firm to the boundaries I'd established? The honest answer was complicated. I wanted my daughter back, but not the version of her that had spent years taking me for granted. I wanted a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not obligation and financial incentive. I wanted to feel valued for who I was, not just what I could provide. But I also recognized that I bore some responsibility for the dynamic we'd fallen into. I'd enabled Madison's behavior for years by always saying yes. Always stepping in, always making excuses for her. I'd trained her to see me as endlessly available and unconditionally supportive, then felt hurt when she took that for granted. Maybe it was time for a different approach. Maybe instead of just punishing past behavior, I needed to clearly communicate what I expected going forward. Maybe redemption was possible, but only if we were both willing to do the work. As autumn deepened into winter, I began to formulate a plan. Not a punishment, not a test, but a path forward that honored both my need for respect and Madison's need for forgiveness. It would require courage from both of us, honesty that might be uncomfortable, and a willingness to build something new, rather than just trying to repair something that had been broken for years. Because at 73 I'd learned that life is too short to waste on relationships that don't nourish your soul. But I'd also learned that love, real love, is worth fighting for, even when the fight is with the people you love most. The question was whether Madison was ready for that kind of fight, or if she just wanted things to go back to the way they were before. Because that wasn't an option anymore. I'd changed, and there was no going back to the woman who'd accepted crumbs and called it a feat. The real test was just beginning. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a peculiar kind of clarity that only comes when you've stripped away the comfortable illusions you've been living with for too long. The bare trees outside my kitchen window reflected how I felt inside, everything exposed and honest in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. Madison's attempts at reconciliation had become more frequent, but also more desperate. Like someone trying to rebuild a house while the foundation was still crumbling. She'd started showing up unannounced, something she hadn't done in years, always with some excuse of course. She needed to borrow my good serving dishes for a client dinner. She wanted to check on my furnace before the real cold set in. She thought I might enjoy this new tea she'd discovered at the farmer's market. Each visit felt choreographed, like she was following a script titled How to Be a Good Daughter that she'd hastily Googled after our phone call about the will. The serving dishes excuse was particularly transparent. Madison had borrowed my grandmother's china 3 years ago for what she called an important business dinner, and had never returned it. Now suddenly she needed to borrow it again, which required a conversation about where it was, which led to an awkward admission that it was still sitting in her dining room cabinet, which led to her promising to bring it back the next day along with a store-bought apple pie and an apology that felt as artificial as the preservatives in the filling. I watched these performances with a mixture of sadness and fascination, like observing an actor who'd forgotten they were supposed to be playing a real person instead of a character. The woman sitting in my living room making careful conversation about the weather and asking pointed questions about my health bore only a superficial resemblance to the daughter I'd raised. This version of Madison was polite, attentive, and completely hollow. The breaking point came on a Thursday in November. I was in my craft room, working on a needlepoint project I'd started as part of my new commitment to doing things purely for my own enjoyment, when I heard Madison's key in the front door. She still had a key from all those times she'd needed to check on the house when I was traveling, but she'd never used it without calling first. The sound of it turning in the lock made something cold settle in my stomach. "Mom?" she called out, her voice artificially bright. "I brought lunch." I set down my needle and thread, taking a moment to prepare myself for whatever performance she had planned this time. When I walked into the kitchen, I found her unpacking containers from the expensive bistro downtown, the kind of place she usually claimed was too pretentious for her taste. "I thought we could have a nice meal together," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I got that salmon salad you like, and those little lemon tarts from the bakery case." The food was beautiful, perfectly arranged on my own plates like a magazine spread. Madison had even brought cloth napkins, and had lit one of my candles. It looked like a scene from a movie about reconciliation, which was probably exactly what she was going for. We ate in relative silence, making the kind of small talk that fills space without actually communicating anything meaningful. Madison complimented my needlepoint, asked about my book club, mentioned that Sophia was doing well in her AP classes. All safe topics, all carefully chosen to avoid any mention of wills or inheritance, or the fundamental issues that had brought us to this strange place. It was only after we'd finished eating, and she was helping me clear the table, that she finally revealed the real purpose of her visit. "Mom," she said, pausing with a stack of plates in her hands, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about feeling like I don't appreciate you, about treating you like an obligation instead of my mother." I waited, saying nothing, because I could tell this was a prepared speech, and interrupting would only throw her off her carefully rehearsed script. I know I haven't been the best daughter. I know I've taken you for granted, and I'm sorry, I really am. I want to do better. The words were right. Technically, they hit all the appropriate notes of contrition and commitment to change, but they felt empty, like coins rattling around in an empty jar. There was no real understanding behind them, no genuine recognition of the specific ways she'd hurt me, or the deeper patterns that needed to change. What does doing better look like to you? I asked. She blinked, clearly not having expected the question. Well, I could call more often, visit more, include you in things. Include me in what things? Another pause. You know, family things, holiday planning, Sophia's school events. I almost laughed, but it would have been bitter enough to spoil the perfectly arranged lunch she'd brought. Madison was offering to include me in events I'd been organizing and attending for years, as if her acknowledgement of my participation was some kind of gift, rather than basic recognition of reality. Madison, I said gently, I don't think you understand what the real problem is. Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. Then explain it to me. So I did. I told her about the years of feeling invisible in her life, except when she needed something. I explained how it felt to be blocked from her social media, not because of any inappropriate behavior on my part, but because she was embarrassed to have people know her mother cared about her life. I described the loneliness of always being the one to reach out, always being the one to make an effort, always being the one to give without receiving. I don't need you to perform being a good daughter, I said. I need you to actually be one, and that means caring about my feelings, even when it's inconvenient for you. It means treating me like a person whose thoughts and opinions matter, not just a resource to be managed. Madison listened with the kind of focused attention that made me think she was preparing her rebuttal, rather than actually absorbing what I was saying. When I finished, she nodded seriously and said, You're right, I can see how my behavior has hurt you, and I want to make it right. But even as she said it, I could see her mentally checking off boxes. Acknowledge wrongdoing, check. Express commitment to change, check. Make vague promises about future behavior, check. It was like watching someone complete a customer service training module rather than having a genuine conversation about our relationship. That's when I realized that Madison didn't actually want to repair our relationship. She wanted to manage the situation until it went away. She wanted to say the right words, make the right gestures, perform the right emotions, until I forgave her and put her back in my will, and we could go back to the way things were before. She didn't want to change. She wanted me to accept her unchanged. After she left that day, taking her empty containers and her half-hearted promises with her, I sat in my living room and felt something shift inside me, not anger, exactly, but a kind of resigned clarity. I couldn't force Madison to love me the way I needed to be loved. I couldn't make her see me as a whole person, rather than just a mother-shaped function in her life. I could only control my own actions and reactions. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove up to the state park where Harold and I used to go hiking, back when my knees were better, and he was still alive to argue with me about which trail to take. It was cold enough that my breath came out in little puffs, and the bare trees created a stark landscape that somehow felt more honest than the manufactured warmth of Madison's recent visit. I walked slowly along the familiar paths, thinking about the woman I'd been when Harold was alive, the woman I'd been when Madison was young, and the woman I was becoming now. Each version felt distinct, like photographs taken years apart that showed the same subject but revealed different aspects of her character. When Madison was little, I'd been the kind of mother who lived for her daughter's happiness. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of how it would affect Madison, where we lived, what activities we did, how we spent our money, even what friends I maintained. Everything revolved around creating the best possible life for her. Harold used to tease me about it, saying I was going to spoil her, but I thought I was just being a good mother. After Harold died, that pattern intensified. Madison was in college then, struggling with her own grief and the normal challenges of early adulthood, and I threw myself into supporting her with the single-minded focus that had previously been divided between wife and mother duty. I helped her through her divorce, supported her decision to move back home with baby Sophia, and gradually became so enmeshed in her life that I'd lost track of where my needs ended and hers began. But this version of me, the 73-year-old woman walking alone through the winter woods, felt different, clearer, somehow, more herself and less defined by her relationships to other people. It was simultaneously lonely and liberating, like finally having permission to be a complete person instead of just someone's mother or grandmother. When I got home that evening, I made myself a simple dinner and sat down with a legal pad to write out my thoughts. Not a letter to Madison, not a plan for confrontation, just an honest assessment of where I stood and what I wanted going forward. What I wanted, I realized, was authenticity. I wanted relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation or transaction. I wanted to be valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. I wanted to feel like the people in my life actually enjoyed my company, rather than just tolerated it out of duty. What I didn't want was to continue pretending that surface-level changes would fix deep-rooted problems. I didn't want to enable Madison's performative attempts at being a good daughter. I didn't want to accept crumbs and call it a feast just because I was hungry for connection. The question was, how to communicate those needs without issuing ultimatums or turning the situation into a power struggle. I didn't want to be the bitter old woman who wielded her money like a weapon, but I also couldn't pretend that financial considerations weren't part of the equation. My will wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, about who I trusted to carry forward the values and priorities that mattered to me. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice things about Madison's behavior that I'd been unconsciously overlooking for years. The way she answered her phone when I called, not with pleasure at hearing from me, but with the barely contained impatience of someone being interrupted. The way she talked about her own plans and problems without ever asking about mine. The way she seemed to view our relationship as something that existed for her benefit rather than something that required mutual investment. But I also noticed things about my own behavior that made me uncomfortable. The way I'd trained her to see me as endlessly available by never saying no to her requests. The way I'd enabled her self-centeredness by always putting her needs first. The way I'd avoided conflict by accepting treatment that didn't feel good rather than risking her displeasure. We'd created this dynamic together, I realized. She'd learned to take because I'd taught her that giving was my primary function. She'd learned to assume my availability because I'd never suggested that my time might be valuable too. She'd learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, because I'd spent decades proving that her happiness was more important to me than my own dignity. The recognition was humbling and empowering at the same time. Humbling because it meant accepting my own role in creating a relationship that had become unsustainable. Empowering because it meant I had the ability to change the patterns I'd helped establish. Right before Thanksgiving, Madison called to discuss holiday plans. Not to invite me to join her plans, but to inform me of what she'd decided, and assume my compliance with her arrangements. I thought we'd do Thanksgiving at my place this year, she said without preamble. Nothing too elaborate, just family. I can handle the turkey if you want to bring the sides you usually make. The assumption that I would, of course, spend my holiday cooking dishes for her dinner party without being asked rankled in a way it never had before. What time were you thinking? I asked, not agreeing but not immediately refusing either. Around 2, I think. That gives me time to get everything ready without rushing. And who's coming? Just us. Me, Sophia, and you. Maybe David if he's not working. David was Madison's on-again, off-again boyfriend, a nice enough man who seemed to exist primarily to provide male companionship without requiring much emotional investment from Madison. The guest list was just family, she'd said, but apparently, that didn't include any of my friends or extended relatives, just the people whose presence she could control and whose conversations she could manage. A small, safe gathering where she could play hostess without having to deal with anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions or expect genuine warmth. Actually, I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded, I've made other plans for Thanksgiving this year. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if she'd hung up. Then, other plans? What kind of other plans? Eleanor Hutchins invited me to join her family's dinner. Her daughter flew in from Seattle, and they wanted an extra person at the table. This was true, though I hadn't given Eleanor an answer yet. The invitation had been casual, the kind of thing neighbors say to be polite without necessarily expecting acceptance. But suddenly, it seemed like exactly what I wanted, a celebration with people who actually wanted my company rather than my cooking. But we always spend Thanksgiving together, Madison said, and I could hear something like panic creeping into her voice. No, you always plan Thanksgiving and assume I'll participate. That's not the same thing as spending it together. I don't understand the difference. And that, right there, was exactly the problem. Madison genuinely couldn't see the difference between including someone in your plans and building plans around their presence. She couldn't distinguish between wanting someone there and expecting them to show up. The difference, I said carefully, is that one involves asking what I want to do, and the other involves telling me what I'm going to do. But I just assumed, I mean, we're family. Of course you'd want to spend the holiday with us. I do want to spend holidays with my family, but I also want to feel like my presence is desired rather than just expected. We talked for another 10 minutes, circling around the same points without really resolving anything. Madison kept insisting that, of course she wanted me there, that it went without saying, that she didn't understand why she needed to formally invite me to family gatherings. I kept trying to explain that assumptions aren't the same as invitations, that being taken for granted doesn't feel the same as being welcomed. In the end, I did spend Thanksgiving with Eleanor's family, and it was a revelation. Her daughter Sarah was funny and warm, asking genuine questions about my life and interests. Eleanor's son-in-law carved the turkey with ceremonial seriousness that made everyone laugh. The conversation flowed naturally from politics to books to travel stories, and nobody checked their phone during dinner or seemed eager for the evening to end. Most importantly, I felt valued there, not as a function or a convenience, but as a person whose presence added something to the gathering. Eleanor introduced me to her relatives as my wonderful neighbor Clem, who makes the most beautiful needlepoint and knows more about local history than anyone. Sarah asked for my cornbread recipe, and genuinely seemed to care about the answer. When I offered to help clean up, Eleanor's granddaughter said, "Oh no, you're a guest. Guests don't do dishes." It was a small thing being called a guest instead of being expected to serve, but it highlighted just how many years I'd spent being taken for granted in my own family. Madison called that evening, ostensibly to see how my day had been, but really to make sure I knew what I'd missed by skipping her dinner. "It was nice," she said with forced brightness. "David brought wine, and Sophia made this amazing sweet potato casserole from a recipe she found online. We missed you though." The "we missed you" felt obligatory, like something she thought she was supposed to say rather than something she actually felt, and maybe that was unfair. Maybe she really had missed me, but it was hard to tell the difference anymore between genuine emotion and performed appropriateness. I had a lovely time with the Hutchins family. Eleanor's daughter is a documentary filmmaker, and she told the most fascinating stories about her work in South America. "Oh, that's nice." The flatness in Madison's voice told me everything I needed to know about her interest in my experience. She'd called expecting to hear about how much I'd regretted missing her dinner, not to listen to me describe having a good time elsewhere. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the different ways people can miss someone. You can miss them because their absence leaves a genuine hole in your life, because conversations are less interesting, and meals less enjoyable without them. Or you can miss them because their absence disrupts your expectations, because it forces you to confront that the relationship you thought was mutual might actually be more one-sided than you realized. I suspected Madison missed me the second way, which explained why her expressions of regret felt so hollow. She hadn't missed my company, she'd missed my compliance with her assumptions. December brought a new challenge when Sophia started applying to colleges. She was a bright girl with good grades and diverse interests, the kind of student who had options. But options require choices, and choices require money, and money meant conversations about financial aid and family contributions and all the messy realities that Madison preferred to avoid until the last possible moment. The first I heard about college applications was from Sophia herself, who mentioned during one of our afternoon visits that she was working on her essays. "Where are you applying?" I asked, genuinely curious about her plan. "Mostly state schools," she said with a shrug that tried to seem casual but didn't quite hide her disappointment. Mom says we need to be practical about costs. Practical about costs. Madison, who spent more on coffee in a month than some families spent on groceries, who'd just bought a new camera for her photography business that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, was suddenly concerned about being practical with her daughter's education. Have you looked at any private schools? Any that might be particularly good for what you want to study? Sophia's face lit up, despite her obvious attempt to stay realistic. There's this amazing program at Davidson College in North Carolina. They have this interdisciplinary major that combines environmental science with policy work, and their alumni network in environmental law is incredible. But it's really expensive, and Mom says we can't afford it. I knew Davidson's reputation and its price tag. It was exactly the kind of school that could open doors for a bright girl like Sophia. Exactly the kind of investment in her future that could pay dividends for decades. It was also exactly the kind of expense that would require either significant family financial support or crushing student debt. Did you apply anyway? I asked. I wanted to, but Mom said there was no point if we couldn't afford it. She said I should focus on realistic options. That evening, I looked up Davidson College's website, reading about their programs and their financial aid policies. They were need-based aid, generous, but they also expected family contributions based on income and assets. The kind of contribution that would be manageable for someone with my resources but difficult for Madison, whose business income was irregular and whose savings were minimal. I found myself thinking about Harold, who'd always believed that education was the one thing you could give a child that no one could ever take away. He'd worked extra shifts at the plant to pay for Madison's college expenses, never complaining about the sacrifice because he saw it as an investment in her future. Madison had graduated debt-free and had never seemed to fully appreciate what a gift that had been. Now she was denying her own daughter the same opportunity, not because the money wasn't available in the family, but because she'd burned her bridges with the person who had it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at Madison but at the entire situation. Here was Sophia, a genuinely good kid with real potential, being limited by her mother's pride and poor judgment. Here was a chance to make a meaningful difference in someone's life, being sacrificed on the altar of family dysfunction. I spent that weekend researching college funding options, financial aid timelines, and the practicalities of educational gifts. By Monday morning I'd made a decision that felt both generous and calculated, both loving and strategic. I was going to pay for Sophia's college education, all of it, wherever she wanted to go. But I wasn't going to tell Madison until the applications were submitted and the acceptances were in hand. Let her daughter dream big and aim high without the artificial limitations Madison had tried to impose. Let Sophia apply to Davidson and anywhere else her heart desired, knowing that the money would be there when she needed it. It was a decision that would force Madison to confront the consequences of her choices in the most direct way possible. She'd alienated the person who could have helped her daughter reach her full potential, and now she'd have to choose between her pride and Sophia's future. The test was about to begin, but Madison didn't know it yet. The January snow fell thick and steady outside my bedroom window, the kind of storm that makes the whole world feel muffled and peaceful. I was sitting at my small writing desk, the one Harold had built for me 40 years ago, composing what might have been the most important letter I'd ever written. Not to Madison, though she probably expected one. Not to Robert Henley, though he'd need to be involved eventually. This letter was to Sophia, and it contained secrets that would reshape her future in ways she couldn't yet imagine. My hands moved slowly across the paper, each word carefully chosen. I'd been thinking about this conversation for weeks, ever since she'd mentioned Davidson College with that careful resignation that broke my heart. 16 years old and already learning to limit her dreams to match other people's limitations. It was exactly the kind of compromise I'd spent too many years making myself. Dear Sophia, I wrote, then stopped, crossed it out, started again. Sweetheart, better, more on it. The coffee in my favorite mug had gone cold while I wrestled with how to explain something that was both simple and incredibly complicated. How do you tell someone that their future is secure without revealing the family drama that made such security necessary? How do you offer freedom without exposing the dysfunction that had made freedom scarce? I'd spent the morning on the phone with Davidson's admissions office, speaking with a counselor named Miss Patterson, who'd been incredibly helpful once I explained that I was a grandmother looking to understand the financial aid process. She'd walked me through deadlines, requirements, and the subtle art of crafting applications that stood out in a sea of qualified candidates. Many of our strongest applicants come from families where education is valued across generations, Mrs. Patterson had said. Students whose grandparents and parents understand that college is an investment in the future, not just an expense in the present. I'd agreed, not mentioning that in my family the generations seemed to have different definitions of investment. The conversation had crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. This wasn't just about paying for Sophia's education, it was about breaking a cycle. Madison had received a debt-free college education and had somehow translated that gift into an assumption that such things simply appeared when needed. She'd never connected Harold's extra shifts with her freedom to study instead of work. She'd never understood that privilege was something to be grateful for and eventually to pass forward. But Sophia was different. I could see it in the way she talked about her future, with excitement tempered by pragmatism. She understood that opportunities weren't guaranteed, that dreams required both vision and resources. She'd grown up watching her mother struggle with the consequences of impractical choices, and she'd learned to be careful in ways Madison never had to be. The letter I was writing would change that careful resignation into confident planning, but it would also put Sophia in an impossible position between her mother and grandmother, unless I handled it exactly right. Sweetheart, I wrote again, there are things about our family that you're old enough to understand now, and conversations that we need to have before you make your college decision. I'm writing this letter because some things are easier to explain on paper than in person, and because I want you to have time to think about what I'm going to tell you. First, the most important thing. Your education is already paid for. All of it. Wherever you want to go, whatever you want to study. I've been saving for your college expenses since the day you were born, and there's enough money to cover 4 years anywhere. Plus graduate school if that's what you choose. I paused, reading the words back. They looked almost magical on the page, like a fairy tale where problems disappeared with the wave of a wand. But fairy tales didn't usually involve the complicated realities of family relationships and wounded pride. Your mother doesn't know about this money yet, and I need you to understand why. This isn't about keeping secrets or playing games. It's about making sure that the decisions you make about your future are based on your dreams and abilities, not on limitations that don't actually exist. I went on to explain, as carefully as I could, about the tension between Madison and me, about the will changes, about my growing realization that money could be both a gift and a weapon depending on how it was wielded. I tried to be fair to Madison while still being honest about our problem. I tried to help Sophia understand that this wasn't about punishment or manipulation, but about ensuring that the next generation didn't inherit the mistakes of the previous ones. The hardest part was explaining what I needed from her. I'm going to ask you to apply everywhere you want to go, including Davidson. Dream big and aim high. When the acceptances come in, we'll tell your mother together about the college fund. That way she can make her own decisions about how to handle the news without feeling pressured or blindsided. I know this puts you in a difficult position, and I'm sorry about that. You shouldn't have to navigate adult problems or keep adult secrets, but you also shouldn't have to limit your future, because the adults in your life haven't figured out how to communicate with each other. I sealed the letter that afternoon and drove to Sophia's school, arriving just as the final bell rang and students poured out into the snowy parking lot. She spotted me immediately, waving with the enthusiasm that reminded me she was still more child than adult, despite her mature approach to college planning. Grandma Clem, what are you doing here? I thought you might want a ride home on such a snowy day, I said, which was true but not the whole truth. Plus I have something for you. She climbed into my car, brushing snow from her backpack and chattering about her day. Chemistry was killing her, but she loved her environmental science class. Her friend Emma was being dramatic about some boy situation. Normal teenage concerns that felt both precious and temporary, given what I was about to add to her world. I waited until we were parked in my driveway, engine off and snow creating a private cocoon around us, before I handed her the letter. "This is important," I said. "Take your time reading it, and don't feel like you have to respond right away, but do read all of it before you say anything." Sophia looked at the envelope with her name written in my careful cursive, then back at me with a puzzled expression. "Is everything okay? You're being kind of mysterious." "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. I watched her face as she read, saw her eyes widen when she reached the part about college being paid for, saw her brow furrow as she worked through the more complicated explanations about family dynamics. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered yard. "So you and Mom are fighting about money," she said finally. "We're disagreeing about respect," I corrected gently. "The money is just how it's playing out. And you want me to apply to expensive schools without telling her that you'll pay for them. I want you to apply to the schools that are right for you, without artificial limitations. Your mother can know about the college fund when she needs to know, not before." Sophia was quiet again, thinking with the seriousness that made me proud and sad at the same time. She was too young to be weighing such complex family politics, but she was also wise enough to understand the implications of what I was offering. What if Mom finds out before we tell her? What if she gets angry with both of us? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. "But Sophia, your future is more important than your mother's pride or my hurt feelings. You're the innocent party in all this adult nonsense, and you shouldn't suffer because we can't get our act together." She looked at me with those serious brown eyes that seemed older than her 16 years. "Will you promise me something? Of course. Will you promise that whatever happens between you and Mom, you won't make me choose sides? I love you both and I don't want to lose either of you because of some stupid fight about money and social media." The question hit me harder than I'd expected. In all my careful planning and strategic thinking, I'd focused on protecting Sophia from limitations, but hadn't fully considered that I might be putting her in the middle of a conflict that wasn't hers to resolve. "I promise," I said, meaning it completely. "This is between your mother and me. You're not responsible for fixing our relationship or managing our feelings about each other." "Good, because I'm definitely applying to Davidson now and probably Stanford too, and maybe that program at Duke. If you're going to pay for college, I'm going to make it worth your money." The grin that spread across her face was worth every complicated conversation that lay ahead. This was what I'd wanted. Sophia free to dream as big as her abilities would take her, unburdened by financial constraints that weren't real anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Sophia threw herself into college applications with the enthusiasm of someone who'd suddenly discovered that the ceiling she'd been accepting was actually just a low-hanging cloud. She researched programs, crafted essays, and reached out to current students at her target schools. Her energy was infectious, reminding me of what it looked like when young people were allowed to pursue their potential without artificial barriers. Madison, meanwhile, continued her campaign of performed daughterhood with increasing desperation. She brought me soup when I had a mild cold, offered to drive me to my doctor's appointment, and even suggested we take a weekend trip together to visit some antique shops I'd mentioned liking. Each gesture felt more forced than the last, like she was following a checklist titled, "Things Good Daughters Do," without understanding the spirit behind any of them. The antique shopping trip was particularly painful. Madison had clearly researched my interest just enough to plan an outing that should have been enjoyable, but she spent the entire day checking her phone, making work calls, and asking pointed questions about my health and financial planning that had nothing to do with the beautiful old furniture we were supposedly there to see. "Are you feeling okay, Mom? You seem tired," she said as we browsed through a shop full of vintage quilts and Depression-era glassware. "I'm fine, honey, just enjoying looking at these beautiful things, because if you're not feeling well, we should make sure all your paperwork is in order. You know, medical directives, financial stuff. I could help you organize everything." The transparency of her concern was almost insulting. She wasn't worried about my health. She was worried about her access to my assets. The woman who'd blocked me on social media 6 months ago was suddenly very interested in making sure my estate planning reflected her priority. "My paperwork is fine," I said, running my hand over a particularly beautiful quilt in a wedding ring pattern. "Robert Henley handles all that for me. Right, but maybe I should meet with him too. You know, just so I understand everything in case something happens. In case something happens. As if my death was an event to be prepared for rather than a loss to be grieved. As if her primary concern about losing her mother was logistical rather than emotional. Madison, I said, setting down the quilt and turning to face her fully. Do you actually want to spend time with me? Or are you just going through the motions because you think it's what you're supposed to do? She looked genuinely surprised by the question. Of course I want to spend time with you, you're my mother. That's not an answer. That's a statement of relationship status. I don't understand what you're asking, and that was exactly the problem. Madison couldn't distinguish between obligation and affection, between performing family relationships and actually having them. She'd been going through the motions for so long that she'd forgotten what authentic connection felt like. We finished the shopping trip in relative silence, Madison clearly frustrated by my refusal to engage with her transparent agenda, me exhausted by the emotional labor of pretending her performance was genuine. When she dropped me off at home that evening, she lingered in the car like she wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. "Mom," she finally said, "I really am trying here." "I know you are," I replied, and I meant, but trying to perform being a good daughter isn't the same as actually being one. "Then, tell me what you want me to do. Give me a list or something. I'll do whatever you want." The fact that she thought love could be reduced to a checklist told me everything I needed to know about how far we'd drifted from each other. You can't create genuine affection by completing tasks. You can't manufacture emotional intimacy by following instructions. I want you to care about my life because you're interested in who I am, not because you're worried about what I might leave you. I want you to call me because you enjoy talking to me, not because you think you should. I want you to include me in your world because you value my presence, not because you're managing my feelings. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process what I was saying. Then her face hardened slightly, the way it used to when she was a teenager and didn't want to hear what I was telling her. "That's not fair, Mom. I do care about you. I do enjoy spending time with you. Just because I'm not perfect doesn't mean my feelings aren't real. Your feelings might be real, but your actions don't reflect them. And at my age, I don't have time to decode what people really mean when their words and behaviors don't match." After she left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the conversation. Maybe I was being too hard on her. Maybe her clumsy attempts at reconciliation were genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship, and I was being unfairly critical because I was still hurt about the social media blocking and everything that had led up to it. But then I remembered the way she'd asked about my paperwork, the calculating look in her eyes when she'd mentioned meeting with Robert Henley, the transparent agenda behind every gesture of concern. Madison wasn't trying to rebuild our relationship. She was trying to manage a situation that had gotten out of her control. February brought a new development that crystallized everything I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Sophia had been accepted to 3 schools already, including Davidson, and was waiting to hear from her remaining choices. Her excitement was barely contained, and she'd started researching everything from dormitory options to study abroad programs. Madison, meanwhile, had become increasingly anxious about college costs. She'd mentioned several times that she was looking into additional financial aid options, and had even suggested that Sophia might want to consider taking a gap year to work and save money. "College will still be there next year," Madison had said during one of our Sunday dinners. "And maybe by then we'll be in a better financial position to handle the expenses." Sophia had nodded politely, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She'd worked hard for 4 years, had gotten into competitive programs, and was being asked to delay her dreams for financial reasons that didn't actually exist. That's when Madison made the phone call that changed everything. I was in my garden planning what to plant when the weather warmed up, when my phone rang. Madison's name appeared on the screen, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the time of day and the tone in her voice when I answered. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. Are you planning to help with Sophia's college expenses?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke, direct and unavoidable, and loaded with all the complicated feelings we'd been dancing around for months. "Why do you ask?" "Because she's been talking about schools we can't afford like they're real possibilities. Because she's acting like money isn't a factor in her decision-making. Because I'm trying to be responsible here and I feel like maybe there's something I don't know." I could have lied,
Could have deflected or changed the subject or told her we'd discuss it later, but something about the genuine worry in her voice, the maternal concern that seemed to override her usual self-interest, made me decide to be honest. Yes, I said simply. I've been saving for Sophia's education since she was born. There's enough to cover wherever she wants to go. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if she'd hung up. Then I heard her breathing, fast and shallow like she was trying not to cry. How much? She asked finally. Enough, more than enough. And you weren't going to tell me. I was waiting for the right time. The right time. She's already applied to schools, already gotten acceptances. When exactly were you planning to share this information? I could hear the anger building in her voice, but underneath it was something else. Relief, maybe, or vindication. The knowledge that her daughter's future was secure, even if it came at the cost of her own pride. I was planning to tell you both together after all the acceptances came in. I wanted Sophia to apply based on her dreams, not on financial limitations. So you let me spend months worrying about how we were going to afford college, let me suggest gap years and in-state schools and all these compromises, when you knew the whole time that money wasn't actually an issue. When she put it like that, it sounded cruel, but it also sounded accurate. I wanted her to have choices, I said, real choices, based on what she wanted rather than what she thought she could afford.
And what about my choices? What about my right to know that my daughter's education was already taken care of? What about my right to participate in planning her future? What about my right to decide how to use my money? What about my right not to be taken for granted? And there it was. The real argument finally out in the open. Not about college funds or financial planning, but about respect and control, and the fundamental question of what we owed each other as family members. This is about the social media thing, isn't it? Madison said, this is your way of punishing me for setting boundaries. This is about you treating me like a resource instead of a person. The social media blocking was just the most obvious example of a pattern that's been going on for years. So you decided to control Sophia's college planning to teach me a lesson. I decided to ensure that Sophia's opportunities weren't limited by our inability to communicate with each other. We argued for another 20 minutes, covering the same ground over and over without reaching any resolution. Madison accused me of manipulation and control. I accused her of taking me for granted and treating our relationship as transactional. We were both right and both wrong, and we were both too angry and hurt to acknowledge the complicated truth that lay somewhere between our competing narratives. When we finally hung up, I felt drained but also oddly relieved. The secret was out, the cards were on the table, and whatever happened next would at least be honest. No more performances, no more careful avoidance of difficult topics. Just the messy reality of a family trying to figure out how to love each other without destroying each other in the process. That evening, Sophia called. Her voice was careful, neutral in the way that suggested she'd already talked to her mother and was trying to navigate between competing loyalties. Grandma Clem? Mom told me about the college money. I figured she would. How are you feeling about it? Grateful, confused. A little guilty. Maybe. What do you have to feel guilty about? Mom's really upset. She feels like you went around her, like you made her look bad by keeping this secret. I sighed, understanding Madison's perspective even as I disagreed with it. Sophia, this was never about making anyone look bad. This was about making sure you had options. I know, and I appreciate it. I really do. But now Mom's talking about not accepting the money, about finding another way to pay for college that doesn't involve family drama. The possibility that Madison might refuse the college fund out of pride had occurred to me, but I'd hoped her love for Sophia would override her wounded ego. Apparently I'd underestimated the depth of her hurt and overestimated her practicality. What do you think about that? I asked. I think it's stupid, Sophia said bluntly. I think pride is a luxury we can't afford when we're talking about my future. But I also don't want to be the reason you and Mom stop speaking to each other. You won't be the reason, sweetheart. If your mother and I stop speaking, it'll be because we've forgotten how to treat each other with kindness and respect. That's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix, but I could fix it, couldn't I? If I just went to a cheaper school, if I made it so the money didn't matter, then you and Mom wouldn't have to fight about it. The fact that she was even considering sacrificing her opportunities to manage our relationship broke my heart. This was exactly what I'd been trying to prevent, the next generation paying the price for the previous generation's dysfunction. Sophia Elizabeth Martinez Davis, I said, using her full name the way I did when she was little and needed to pay attention. You are not responsible for managing the relationship between your mother and grandmother. You are responsible for making the best decisions for your own future. Let the adults handle the adult problems. Easier said than done when the adult problems are affecting my life. She had a point. Our family drama was directly impacting her college decisions, and pretending otherwise was naive. But the alternative, asking her to choose between her educational dreams and family peace, was worse. Here's what I propose. You accept Davidson's offer, or Stanford's, or wherever you most want to go. You let me pay for it because that's what the money is for, and because your education is more important than anyone's hurt feeling. And you let your mother and me figure out how to be family members who support each other, instead of tearing each other down. And if you can't figure that out, then at least you'll have the education and opportunities you need to build a life that doesn't depend on our ability to get along. It was a sobering thought, but also a liberating one. Whatever happened between Madison and me, Sophia would be equipped to succeed independently. She wouldn't have to manage family relationships or financial drama because her own foundation would be solid. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the conversation. In trying to protect Sophia from our family dysfunction, I'd inadvertently made her the center of it. In trying to ensure her independence, I'd put her in the position of having to choose between her dreams and her mother's pride. But maybe that was the reality of transitional generation. Maybe part of growing up was learning to navigate the complicated legacy of family relationships while building something better for the next generation. Maybe Sophia's strength and clarity were exactly what our family needed to break the cycles we'd been perpetuating. The real question now was whether Madison and I could find a way forward that honored both our hurt feelings and our love for Sophia. Whether we could separate our individual relationship problems from our shared commitment to the next generation, whether we could be mature enough to put Sophia's future ahead of our own pride. The answer would determine not just where Sophia went to college, but what kind of family she'd be part of for the rest of her life. The silence between Madison and me stretched into March like a stubborn winter that refused to give way to spring. We hadn't spoken since our phone call about the college fund, though Sophia served as an unwilling messenger between us, carrying updates and questions with the weary resignation of someone who'd been drafted into a war she didn't understand. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the way she measured her words carefully when talking about her mother, the way she avoided mentioning college plans, unless I brought them up first. Madison had made her position clear through Sophia. She would find another way to pay for college, a way that didn't involve accepting what she called manipulation money from me. She'd started researching loans, scholarships and work-study programs with the determined energy of someone trying to prove a point. It was admirable and infuriating in equal measure, watching her choose financial struggle over swallowing her pride. I spent my days trying to stay busy enough not to think about the standoff we'd created. My watercolor painting had improved considerably, mainly because I was pouring all my frustrated energy into getting the light just right on the winter landscapes I kept attempting. The book club had become a refuge where I could discuss other people's family dramas instead of living my own. Even my bridge group had noticed my distraction, though they were too polite to ask directly what was troubling me. But it was impossible to ignore the situation completely, especially when Sophia's college decision deadline was approaching and I could see her growing anxiety about disappointing someone no matter what choice she made. She'd been accepted to Davidson, Stanford and 3 other excellent schools, but instead of celebrating these achievements, she seemed paralyzed by the implications of accepting any of them. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in mid-March. I was reorganizing my linen closet, a task I'd been putting off for months, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway with more force than necessary. Through the window I could see Madison stalking toward my front door, her jaw set in the determined line I remembered from her teenage years, when she'd decided to have a confrontation whether the other person was ready or not. She didn't knock. The doorbell didn't ring. Instead I heard her key in the lock followed by her voice calling out with barely controlled anger, "Mom, We need to talk. Now, I set down the stack of towels I'd been folding and walked to the living room, where Madison stood dripping rainwater onto my hardwood floors, her hair plastered to her head, and her eyes bright with the kind of fury that comes from weeks of festering resentment. Finally finding an outlet. Sophia got a letter today, she said without preamble, from Davidson. They're offering her a partial scholarship, but she still needs to respond to their original acceptance by next Friday. And you know what she told me? She told me she can't decide because she doesn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I opened my mouth to respond, but Madison held up a hand to stop me. A 16-year-old girl is agonizing over college decisions because the adults in her life are more concerned with being right than with what's best for her. Do you realize how insane that is? She was right, and we both knew. Somewhere in our battle of wills and wounded pride, we'd lost sight of the person who mattered most in this equation. Sophia had worked hard for 4 years to earn these opportunities, and now she was being asked to navigate family politics, instead of simply choosing the school that would serve her best. What do you want me to do? I asked, genuinely curious about how Madison thought we should resolve this impasse. I want you to admit that keeping the college fund secret was wrong. I want you to acknowledge that you manipulated this entire situation to make yourself look generous and me look like a failure. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be uncomfortable. I had wanted to ensure Sophia's options weren't limited, but I'd also wanted Madison to confront the consequences of taking me for granted. The college fund had been both gift and weapon, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. And then what? I asked. After I admit I was wrong, then what happens? Then we figure out how to move forward without destroying our family in the process. Madison pulled off her wet jacket and sat down heavily on my sofa, suddenly looking exhausted rather than angry. For the first time in months she seemed like my daughter rather than an adversary, and I felt something soften in my chest despite my determination to stay guarded. I've been thinking about this for weeks, she continued, and I keep coming back to the same question. How did we get here? How did we get to a place where we're using Sophia's future as a battlefield for our own issue? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself during those long nights when sleep eluded me, and I found myself replaying years of conversations and missed opportunities for connection. How had we drifted so far from each other that basic communication felt impossible? I think it started long before the social media blocking, I said slowly. I think it started when you were going through your divorce and moved back in with Sophia. I got so used to being needed, to being essential to your daily functioning, that I forgot how to be your mother instead of your support system. Madison looked surprised by my answer, like she'd expected defensiveness or blame rather than introspection. And I got so used to leaning on you that I forgot you were a person with your own needs and feelings, she admitted. I started seeing you as this constant in my life, always available, always willing to help, and I stopped thinking about what I was giving back to the relationship. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the recognition that our problems ran deeper than social media boundaries or college funds. We'd created a dynamic where I gave and she took, where my value was measured by my utility rather than my intrinsic worth as a person. The social media blocking wasn't really about boundaries, Madison said finally. It was about embarrassment. I was embarrassed that my friends could see how much you cared about my life when I wasn't sure I deserved that level of attention. I was embarrassed that you were so proud of things I didn't feel proud of myself. This was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, and it hurt and healed simultaneously. The hurt came from knowing my expressions of love had been received as sources of shame. The healing came from understanding that her rejection hadn't been about me being too much, but about her feeling like too little. Why didn't you just tell me that? I asked. Why didn't you explain instead of just blocking me? Because I didn't understand it myself until recently. I thought I was just setting healthy boundaries, but really I was running away from my own feelings of inadequacy. The rain continued to pelt against the windows, creating a rhythm that seemed to encourage honesty. We were having the conversation we should have had months ago, the one that required vulnerability instead of defensiveness. I changed my will because I was hurt, I said, not just by the social media thing, but by years of feeling taken for granted. I wanted you to understand that relationships have consequences, that treating people poorly eventually costs you something, and the college fund secret? That was more complicated. I genuinely wanted Sophia to have choices,
but I also wanted you to realize that your pride could cost her opportunities. I wanted you to see that sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Madison nodded slowly, her anger apparently exhausted and replaced by something that looked like understanding. So where does that leave us now? She asked. It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. We could continue our standoff, each of us convinced of our own righteousness and the other's wrongness. We could maintain our positions until Sophia's college deadlines forced a crisis that would damage all our relationships permanently. Or we could find a way forward that acknowledged our mistakes, while prioritizing what mattered most. I have an idea, I said, but you're not going to like it initially. Try me. I think we should go to family therapy, all three of, before Sophia makes her college decision. Before we make any other major choices about money or relationships or boundaries. I think we need someone neutral to help us figure out how to be a family that supports each other instead of undermining each other. Madison's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, resistance, consideration, and finally resignation. You're right, she said. I don't like it. The idea of airing our family drama to a stranger makes me want to crawl under a rock. But you're also right that we can't keep doing this to Sophia. There's something else, I said, knowing this next part would be even harder for her to accept. I want to restore you to my will. Not because you've earned it back, but because I realized I was using my money as a weapon instead of a tool for building the family I actually want. Madison's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away quickly, trying to maintain the composure she'd been clinging to since she'd arrived. I don't want your money because I deserve it, she said quietly. I want a relationship with my mother that isn't poisoned by resentment and misunderstanding. The money feels secondary to that. It was exactly what I'd needed to hear. The acknowledgement that our relationship mattered more than any financial consideration, but it also raised new questions about how to rebuild trust that had been damaged by months of hurt feelings and strategic maneuvering. What about Sophia's college? I asked. I want you to pay for it, not because I can't figure out another way, but because that money represents your love for her and your investment in her future. She shouldn't be punished for our inability to communicate like adults. The relief I felt was overwhelming, like a weight I'd been carrying for months had suddenly been lifted. Sophia would get to attend Davidson, or Stanford, or wherever her heart led her, without the shadow of family dysfunction clouding her excitement about the future. But I have conditions, Madison continued, and I braced myself for whatever requirement she'd develop during her weeks of anger and planning. I want to be involved in the financial planning, not controlling it, but informed about it. I want to understand what you're paying for and what Sophia's responsibilities will be. I want us to make these decisions together instead of you surprising me with them. It was a reasonable request, the kind of collaborative approach we should have been taking all along. The secrecy and surprise revelations had been tactics born of hurt feelings rather than sound family planning, and I want us to establish some ground rules for family financial decisions going forward, not just about Sophia's education, but about everything. When do we consult each other? When do we make independent choices? How do we handle disagreements without resorting to ultimatums and punishment? Again, perfectly reasonable. Madison was thinking like an adult who wanted to be treated as an equal partner in family decisions, rather than a child who received announcements about choices that had already been made. I can agree to all of that, I said, but I have a condition too. What? I want you to unblock me on social media, not because I need to see your posts, but because I need to know that you're not ashamed of having me in your life. I need to feel like you're proud to be my daughter, not just grateful for my financial support. Madison winced, clearly having hoped we could resolve our financial and practical issues without addressing the more personal hurt feelings that had started this whole mess. Mom, it was never about being ashamed of you. Then what was it about? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands while she formulated her answer. It was about feeling like I couldn't live up to the image of me that you were projecting online. Every time you shared one of my business posts, or commented about how proud you were of something I'd accomplished, I felt like a fraud, like you were celebrating this successful, confident version of me that didn't match how I saw myself. This was deeper than I'd realized, touching on Madison's fundamental insecurities about her own worth and accomplishments. She hadn't been rejecting my love so much as questioning whether she deserved it. Honey, I said gently, I wasn't projecting a false image of you. I was celebrating the real you, the one you apparently can't see clearly, but that's the problem. You see me as this amazing daughter and successful businesswoman and devoted mother, and I know all the ways I fall short of that image. I know how often I'm selfish, or lazy, or just going through the motions. Having you broadcast your pride in me felt like living a lie. The pain in her voice was raw and real, and it explained so much about her behavior over the past few years. She'd been rejecting my affection, not because she didn't want it, but because she didn't think she deserved it. Madison, you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You don't have to earn my pride or prove that you deserve my affection. You're my daughter. That's not conditional on your performance or achievements. I know that intellectually, but feeling it is different. Then we need to work on that too. In therapy, in our daily interactions, in how we talk to each other about mistakes and failures and ordinary human imperfection. The conversation continued for another hour, covering ground we should have explored years ago. We talked about expectations and disappointments, about the difference between support and enabling, about how to express love in ways that felt affirming rather than pressuring. It was emotionally exhausting and incredibly necessary. By the time Madison left that evening, we'd established the framework for a different kind of relationship, not perfect, not without the potential for future conflict, but honest in a way that felt sustainable. We'd scheduled our first family therapy appointment for the following week, and Madison had promised to call Davidson to explain that Sophia would be accepting their offer. Most importantly, she'd pulled out her phone and unblocked me on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok while we were sitting there together. "Don't go crazy with the commenting," she said with a smile that felt genuinely warm for the first time in months, "but you can like my posts again." "Deal," I said, meaning it. That night I called Robert Henley to schedule a meeting about restoring Madison to my will. It felt good to be making decisions based on hope rather than hurt, to be planning for a future where our families supported each other instead of undermining each other. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Sophia. "Mom told me about Davidson. I can't believe this is really happening. Thank you, Grandma Clem, for everything. I love you so much." Reading those words, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: uncomplicated joy, pure happiness for my granddaughter's future, unmarred by family drama or complicated motivations. It was the feeling I'd been trying to protect when I'd set up the college fund in the first place, and finally, it felt possible again. But even as I celebrated this resolution, I knew the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding trust and establishing new patterns of communication would take time and consistent effort. We'd have to learn how to disagree without escalating to ultimatums, how to express needs without manipulating outcomes, how to love each other imperfectly but authentically. The family therapy sessions would probably be uncomfortable, forcing us to examine behaviors and assumptions we'd been taking for granted for years. Madison would have to work on accepting love she didn't think she'd earn.
I would have to work on expressing concerns without resorting to financial leverage. Sophia would have to learn that her family's dysfunction wasn't her responsibility to manage. But for the first time in months, I felt optimistic about our chances. We'd managed to have an honest conversation without anyone storming out or saying unforgivable things. We'd found a way to prioritize Sophia's future while addressing our own relationship issues. We'd chosen vulnerability over defensiveness and collaboration over control. It wasn't the family I'd imagined when Madison was small and the future seemed simpler, but it was the family we actually were, with all our complications and imperfections and capacity for growth. And maybe that was enough to build on. The spring that had been reluctant to arrive finally began showing itself in earnest. Daffodils pushed up through the last patches of snow, and the bare branches of my maple tree started showing the tiniest hints of green. It felt symbolic, this emergence of new life after a long, difficult winter. We weren't starting over exactly, but we were growing into something different, something that might be stronger for having weathered the storms. Madison started coming by more often, not with the desperate frequency of her post-will change campaign, but with the casual regularity of someone who genuinely enjoyed spending time together. We worked in my garden, planning what to plant and when. We cooked dinner together while Sophia did homework at my kitchen table. We watched old movies and argued amiably about plot holes and character motivations. It was ordinary and precious, the kind of low-key family time I'd been longing for, but hadn't known how to create. The difference was that it felt chosen rather than obligatory, organic rather than performed. Our first therapy session was as awkward as expected, with all three of us sitting stiffly in uncomfortable chairs while Dr. Martinez asked gentle questions about our family dynamic. But even that awkwardness felt productive, like we were finally naming things that had been hiding in plain sight for years. "What I'm hearing," Dr. Martinez said during our second session, "is that you all love each other very much, but you've lost trust in your ability to express that love in ways that feel good to receive." It was a simple observation that somehow cut to the heart of our problem. We'd been so focused on the specific incidents and hurt feelings that we'd lost sight of the underlying affection that had motivated all our clumsy attempts at connection. By the time Sophia's graduation approached in May, we'd established new rhythms and patterns that felt sustainable. Madison consulted me about major financial decisions affecting Sophia, but she also maintained her independence in areas that didn't require family input. I expressed my opinions and concerns without resorting to ultimatums or financial pressure. Sophia focused on her own goals and interests without feeling responsible for managing our relationship. The night before Sophia's graduation, I sat in my backyard with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint my garden in soft gold light. Madison and Sophia were inside, arguing good-naturedly about what shoes went best with Sophia's graduation dress. It was the kind of normal family moment I'd feared we might never have again. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Thank you for not giving up on us." I typed back, "Thank you for fighting for us." And I meant it. The easy thing would have been to let our hurt feelings calcify into permanent resentment. The easy thing would have been to maintain our stubborn positions until Sophia's college departure created a natural break in our relationships. But we'd chosen the harder path of actually working through our problems, and the results were worth every uncomfortable conversation and therapy session. Sophia would be leaving for Davidson in the fall, armed with the education and opportunities that came from having a family that, despite its imperfections, had figured out how to put her needs first when it mattered most. She'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself, about the importance of honest communication, and about the difference between enabling dysfunction and supporting growth. As for Madison and me, we were still works in progress. We probably always would be, but we'd proven to ourselves and each other that love was stronger than pride, that relationships could be repaired without erasing the damage they'd sustained, and that it was never too late to choose a different way of being family. The money had been important, both the college fund and the inheritance, but it had never been the real issue. The real issue had been respect, recognition. My daughter blocked me on social media, so I blocked her access to my social security fortune, and the fundamental human need to feel valued for who you are, rather than what you can provide. We'd found a way to honor those needs while building something better for the next generation. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when this whole mess started, but it was better than anything I'd dared to hope for during those dark months, when it seemed like our family might be irreparably broken. We'd learned that love alone wasn't enough to sustain relationships, but love combined with effort, honesty, and the willingness to change could create something beautiful and lasting. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities we were finally ready to explore together. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of my same house, but everything felt different. The morning light streamed through windows I'd finally replaced, casting warm rectangles across countertops that no longer felt like a stage for family drama. Madison was due to arrive any minute with coffee and the latest photos from Sophia's sophomore year at Davidson, and for the first time in years I was looking forward to the visit without any underlying tension or unspoken agendas. The transformation hadn't been instant or dramatic. There was no single moment when everything clicked into place and our family dysfunction magically resolved itself. Instead, it had been a gradual process of learning to trust each other again, of building new habits that served us better than the old patterns we'd been trapped in. Therapy had helped, but mostly it had been the daily choice to show up for each other authentically, even when it was uncomfortable. Madison had changed her business model about 6 months after our reconciliation. shifting from wedding photography to documentary work that felt more aligned with her actual interests. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd needed to feel secure in our relationship before she could take the professional risks that made her genuinely happy. Her Instagram feed now showed behind-the-scenes shots from the small films she worked on, candid moments that felt real rather than curated. And yes, occasionally photos of family dinners where I appeared without her feeling embarrassed about it. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts, and I opened it to find Madison holding a bakery box and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had become common again, but still made my heart lift every time I saw it. "I brought those almond croissants you like," she said, kissing my cheek in greeting. "And I have news, good news or bad news. Depends on how you feel about me potentially moving to Portland for 6 months to work on a documentary about urban farming." I poured coffee while she unpacked pastries and pulled out her laptop to show me photos from her latest project. The work was beautiful, thoughtful in a way that her wedding photography had never quite achieved. She'd found her artistic voice, and it was stronger and more interesting than I think even she had realized. "Portland sounds amazing," I said, meaning it. "When would you leave?" "This fall, if the funding comes through, which brings me to the real reason I wanted to talk to you today." Madison's tone shifted slightly, taking on the careful quality that usually preceded request for advice or support. But unlike the old days, this carefulness felt respectful rather than manipulative, like she was approaching a topic that mattered to both of us. "I've been thinking about asking you to come with me, not to work on the project, but just to experience a new place together. We could rent one of those extended stay apartments, explore the city, maybe take some day trips to the coast." The suggestion caught me completely off guard, not because it was unreasonable, but because it represented such a fundamental shift from our old dynamic. Madison was inviting me to share an adventure rather than asking me to solve a problem. She wanted my company for the pleasure of it, not because she needed something I could provide. "What about Sophia? Her winter break isn't that long." "Sophia's planning to spend winter break in North Carolina with her roommate's family anyway. Something about wanting to experience Christmas in the mountains. Plus, she's 20 now, Mom. She doesn't need us to coordinate our lives around her schedule anymore." This was true but still felt startling. Somewhere during the focus on college applications and family therapy, Sophia had grown into a young woman who made her own holiday plans and managed her own relationship. She called me regularly to share stories about her environmental science courses and her new boyfriend, but she no longer needed me to be the center of her world. "I'd love to come to Portland with you," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was completely true, "but only if you promise not to feel obligated to entertain me every minute. I want to be your travel companion, not your responsibility." Madison laughed, the kind of easy sound that had been rare during the years when every interaction felt loaded with unexpressed resentment. "Deal, though I should warn you that I'm planning to drag you to every farmer's market in the city. It's research for the documentary. I love farmers markets." "That sounds perfect." We spent the next hour planning potential travel dates and researching neighborhoods in Portland, falling into the kind of collaborative planning that had become natural again. Madison asked my opinion without treating it as binding law. I offered suggestions without expecting them to be followed exactly. We were functioning like equals who enjoyed each other's company, which still felt miraculous sometimes. Around noon, my phone rang with Sophia's contact photo filling the screen. She was grinning in the picture, wearing her Davidson sweatshirt and holding up a chemistry textbook like a trophy. The photo was from her freshman year when everything about college still felt new and exciting. "Grandma Clem, perfect timing. I just got out of my organic chemistry lab and I'm walking across campus, thinking about how grateful I am for everything." Sophia's voice carried that particular mix of confidence and enthusiasm that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. She'd thrown herself into college life with the energy of someone who'd never doubted she belonged there, and the results had been everything I'd hoped when I'd first started saving for her education. "How's the chemistry going?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker so Madison could listen to. "It's hard, but I love it. Professor Williams says I have an intuitive understanding of molecular structures,
which apparently is rare. I'm thinking about adding a chemistry minor to my environmental science major. Madison and I exchanged glances across the kitchen table. This was the kind of academic confidence that came from having options, from never having to choose between intellectual curiosity and financial practicality. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, Madison said. Are you sure you can handle the extra coursework? Mom, I'm fine, better than fine. I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do. Besides, David's in my chemistry lab, so we can study together. David was the boyfriend, a junior from Vermont who was majoring in sustainable agriculture and apparently shared Sophia's passion for solving environmental problems through science. I'd met him via video chat a few times and had been impressed by his thoughtfulness and the way he looked at Sophia like she was the most interesting person in any room. Tell David I said hello, and tell him I'm still expecting him to visit this summer so I can interrogate him properly in person. Grandma Clem, you are not going to interrogate my boyfriend. I absolutely am. It's my grandmother privilege. Sophia laughed, and I could picture her rolling her eyes in that affectionate way she'd perfected over the years. Actually, that's part of why I called. David and I are planning to spend a week with you this summer before we start our internship. He wants to learn how to make your famous apple pie and I promised him you'd teach him. The easy assumption that my house would be open to her and her boyfriend, that I'd welcome them and enjoy their company filled me with quiet satisfaction. This was what healthy family relationships looked like. Mutual affection expressed through hospitality freely given and gratefully received. Of course I'll teach him to make pie. What kind of internships are you starting? David got into this amazing sustainable farming program in Oregon, and I'm working with the Environmental Law Clinic in Asheville. We're both so excited. After we hung up, Madison and I sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the conversation. Sophia's life was unfolding exactly as it should. Challenging academic work, meaningful relationships, summer experiences that would enhance her future career prospects. She was confident and happy and independent in all the ways we'd hoped she would be. She sounds so grown up, Madison said finally. She sounds like someone who never had to worry that her dreams were too expensive or impractical. Thanks to you, thanks to us, I corrected. We figured out how to put her first when it mattered. Madison nodded, and I could see her working through emotions that were probably similar to my own. Pride in Sophia's accomplishments, gratitude for the financial security that had made them possible, and maybe a little sadness that this phase of active parenting was essentially over. Sophia would always be our daughter and granddaughter, but she no longer needed us to manage her life or solve her problems. Can I ask you something? Madison said. Do you ever regret how long it took us to figure this out? Do you wish we'd been able to skip all the drama and fighting and just have a normal relationship from the beginning? It was a question I'd considered many times during our recovery process. There had certainly been moments when I'd mourned the years we'd lost to miscommunication and resentment, the family dinners that had felt tense rather than joyful, the holidays clouded by unspoken hurt feelings. I used to regret it, but honestly I think we needed to go through what we went through to end up where we are now. We had to learn that relationships require intentional effort, that love alone isn't enough if you don't know how to express it in ways that feel good to receive. Plus, if we'd figured it out earlier, we might have taken it for granted. The work we put into rebuilding makes what we have now feel more precious. Madison was right. The relationship we had now felt deliberately chosen rather than accidentally inherited. We'd both had to examine our patterns and assumptions, to take responsibility for our contributions to the dysfunction, and to actively choose different behaviors going forward. There's something else I want to tell you, Madison said, reaching for her purse. I've been working on a project for the past few months, and I finally finished it. She pulled out a small wrapped package, and handed it to me with the kind of nervous excitement that suggested this was more significant than a casual gift. Inside the wrapping paper was a leather-bound photo album, the kind with thick pages and careful attention to archival quality. The first page contained a photo I'd never seen before, Harold and me at Madison's college graduation, both of us beaming with pride as she walked across the stage. He had his arm around my shoulders and I was clapping enthusiastically, my face radiant with joy for our daughter's achievement. I found this in Dad's old camera bag, Madison explained. He'd taken a whole roll of film that day but never developed it. I had it processed last month. The album chronicled our family history through pictures I'd forgotten existed, moments Harold had captured but we'd never seen. There were photos from Sophia's early childhood, family dinners, holiday celebrations, ordinary afternoons that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious in their mundane happiness. But what made the album truly special was Madison's commentary. Each page included handwritten notes describing what she remembered about the moments captured, what they'd meant to her then and what they meant to her now. Her words were honest about both the good times and the difficult ones, acknowledging the complexity of our relationships while celebrating what we'd built together. "This is beautiful," I said, turning pages slowly and reading her reflections. "Thank you. I wanted you to know that I remember the good times too, not just the fights and misunderstandings, but all the ways you've shown up for our family over the years, all the ways you've loved us, even when we didn't make it easy." The album ended with recent photos, Sophia's graduation from high school, family dinners from the past year, candid shots from our renewed relationship. The final page contained a letter Madison had written but never given me, expressing thoughts she'd apparently needed to work through before she could share them. "Mom," the letter began, "I've been trying to figure out how to apologize for years of taking you for granted, but I keep realizing that apologies aren't enough. What you need from me isn't regret about the past, but different behavior in the future. So instead of just saying sorry, I want to promise you some things. I promise to see you as a whole person with interests and opinions that matter, not just as my mother whose function is to support my choices. I promise to express gratitude for your generosity without waiting until I need something from you. I promise to include you in my life because I value your presence, not because family obligation requires. I promise to trust that your love for me isn't conditional on my performance, and to stop rejecting affection because I don't think I've earned it. Most importantly, I promise to keep working on being the daughter you deserve, not because I want back in your will, but because our relationship is worth the effort it takes to sustain it. I love you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on us." By the time I finished reading, both Madison and I were crying, but it was the good kind of crying that comes from feeling deeply understood and appreciated. The letter captured everything I'd been trying to communicate during our difficult months, all the needs I'd struggled to articulate without sounding demanding or manipulative. "I love you too," I said, closing the album and reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "And I'm so proud of the woman you've become, not just in the past 2 years but throughout your whole life. You've always been enough, Madison. I just needed you to believe it too." We sat together in my kitchen, holding hands across the table and letting the weight of everything we'd been through settle into something that felt like peace. Outside, spring was asserting itself with the kind of determined cheerfulness that made winter seem like a distant memory. My garden was full of new growth, plants that had survived the cold months and emerged stronger for the experience. Later that afternoon, Madison helped me plant the flower beds we'd planned together, working in comfortable companionship while we discussed logistics for the Portland trip and speculated about Sophia's summer internship. It was ordinary family time, the kind I'd learned not to take for granted after nearly losing it entirely. That evening, after Madison had gone home and I was cleaning up the dinner dishes, I found myself thinking about the question she'd asked earlier about regret. The truth was, I didn't regret the difficult period we'd navigated together. It had taught us things about ourselves and each other that we might never have learned otherwise. I'd learned that love without respect is ultimately unsustainable, that generosity without appreciation becomes resentment, and that family relationships require the same intentional effort as any other kind of meaningful connection. Madison had learned that she was worthy of love without having to earn it through performance, that accepting help could be an act of wisdom rather than weakness, and that vulnerability was often the price of genuine intimacy. Most importantly, we'd both learned that it's never too late to choose a different way of being family, to examine patterns that aren't serving anyone and replace them with something healthier. We'd proven to ourselves that relationships could be repaired without erasing their history, that love could be stronger than pride when people were willing to do the work. The money had played its role in our story, both as weapon and gift, as symbol of control and expression of love. But ultimately, the financial considerations had been secondary to the deeper issues of respect, recognition, and the fundamental human need to feel valued. We'd found a way to honor those needs while building something sustainable for the future. Sophia would graduate from Davidson in 2 years with opportunities and connections that would serve her well throughout her career. She'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself, about the importance of honest communication, and about the difference between enabling dysfunction and supporting growth. Most importantly, she'd seen that families could work through serious problems without destroying each other in the process. As I turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, my phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Thank you for today. Thank you for everything. Love you." I typed back, "Love you too. Sweet dreams." It was a simple exchange, the kind that happened between us regularly now, but it still made me smile. This easy expression of affection that had once felt so fraught and complicated. We'd found our way back to each other, not by ignoring the problems that had divided us, but by facing them directly and choosing something better. The house settled around me as I prepared for bed, filled with the comfortable quiet that comes from days well spent and relationships well tended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I felt complete in a way that had eluded me for years. I had my daughter back, not as a performer trying to earn my approval, but as a genuine partner in the ongoing project of being family. My granddaughter was thriving at college, pursuing her dreams without artificial limitations or family drama clouding her horizons. My inheritance would eventually go to people who valued the relationships behind the money, rather than just the financial security itself. My social media feeds were full of authentic moments rather than carefully curated performances. It wasn't the story I'd expected to tell when I'd first discovered I was blocked from Madison's digital life. I'd thought this would be a tale of punishment and vindication, of teaching lessons through financial consequences. Instead, it had become a story about the hard work of loving people imperfectly but authentically, about the courage required to examine our own contributions to family dysfunction, and about the surprising grace that becomes possible when people choose vulnerability over defensiveness. The real victory wasn't in being proven right or in having my will changes acknowledged as justified. The real victory was in building a family that supported each other's growth rather than demanding each other's compliance, that celebrated individual achievements while maintaining collective bonds, that could disagree without deploying ultimate weapons like inheritance threats or social media blocking. 6 months later, I received a package from Portland containing local coffee beans, artisanal honey, and a note from Madison describing the documentary she was working on. She sounded energized and fulfilled in a way that made me grateful we'd found the courage to work through our problems, rather than allowing them to permanently divide us. The note ended with an invitation. "The project wraps up in December, and I want to celebrate by hosting Christmas here. David's family is flying out from Vermont, and Sophia's bringing her roommate. It'll be chaotic and wonderful, and nothing like our traditional celebrations, but I think that's exactly what we need. Say yes." I called her immediately to say yes, to tell her how proud I was of her work and to start planning what I might contribute to a Christmas celebration that would be different from anything we'd ever done before. It felt symbolic, this willingness to create new traditions, rather than clinging to old patterns that had outlived their usefulness. As I hung up the phone, I realized that was what redemption looked like, not the restoration of old dynamics, but the creation of something entirely new. We'd moved beyond forgiveness into genuine transformation, beyond repairing what was broken into building something stronger in its place. The daughter who had once blocked me on social media now sent me daily photos from her work on environmental justice documentary. The granddaughter whose college education had been threatened by family dysfunction was thriving academically and personally. The family relationships that had once felt transactional now felt genuinely reciprocal. It had taken 75 years for me to learn that the most powerful inheritance I could leave wasn't money, but the example of a family that had learned to love each other well despite their imperfections. That was a legacy worth fighting for, and finally it was one we'd actually achieved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.